Painted Ladies, right? Everybody knows the Painted Ladies of San Francisco. It's the iconic architectural image. If anybody's seen Full House or any television show that's ever been filmed in San Francisco, they know this image from Alamo Square. And it's striking, right? The Victorian houses, the shared party walls, the repeated details. Like, this is how people understand San Francisco. And it's pre-modern, right? That it's referencing another time from another country, another process of construction, and it's got, you know, if anybody's ever lived in one of these houses, small cellular rooms, not a lot of light. It's kind of like a rabbit warren. You're walking through it. And so what does that mean, you know, to this place? This is the kind of foundation, the framework of how we start to see the city. And so as I was thinking about modernism, I was telling Braden this earlier, the idea of it started to expand. It started off thinking about international modernism, and then it reached further and further. And so this is the Flood building. You guys know the Flood building, right? I imagine any of you who've taken BART has seen this. This is 1904. And the reason that I'm including this is that it feels like a reference to Burnham and Root, right? It's early steel architecture in San Francisco. Oh, it's hard to believe this was a skyscraper, but it was, right? It's also full of rich history, right? Dashiell Hammett worked here. And the Thin Man series, which if you guys don't know that, you should. They're fantastic. And the inside, which you can see in the upper right, it's hard with the light here, but it's got these beautiful slabs of book-matched marble that go down all the hallways, right? It looks like Adolphe Loos's Bar Americain. It has this idea of this very minimal decoration, but it's just rich. And every time I go into that building, I think, like, God, like, I just wish I had a budget like this. And, you know, the other thing that's really interesting about it is it's San Franciscan in that it's dealing with the unique geometries of Market Street, dealing with the rest of the grid, right? And we take that for granted now, but this kind of prow shape is really interesting. So then it's this layer cake of different styles, but really modern in construction. Here it is under construction, right? And all of a sudden, it feels totally different, right? We see it stripped naked. Extremely modern building in San Francisco that we walk by every day, right? We had the earthquake in 1906, and during the destruction from the earthquake and the subsequent fire, half of the city was homeless. The city is trying to reestablish itself, and how much of it is modeling on the old ideas and how much of it is kind of acknowledging new technology, new systems, right? So here's some of the earthquake sheds that were set up around the city. Dolores Park, the Presidio, were all filled with little, what we would now call micro-housing, right? Each one of these was 200 square feet. You would have families in them. I mean, we have precedents for how to deal with the homelessness crisis here in San Francisco. But kind of moving forward from this, the idea is, how do we rebuild? What image does San Francisco want to convey to the rest of the world, and how does it want to show itself, right? So this is the Roos House by Bernard Maybeck. I'm hoping you all know who Bernard Maybeck is, right? One of the pioneers of the arts and crafts movement in California. The Roos was a clothing magnet, and this is in Laurel Heights and Pacific Heights. To understand the size, that fireplace is about 7 feet tall, or 2+ meters tall. It's this huge, great room. And there's this idea of rebuilding this kind of resplendent wood architecture, and that was what it meant to be in California. Kind of simultaneously, you have something like this happening. Do you guys know this project? Right, this is the Eastern Outfit Company building. It's on Market and 6th. It was built by George Applegarth in 1909, right? And he's playing with a couple of different ideas here. You know, first he has these giant Corinthian columns on both sides. Again, doesn't necessarily seem modern except for the scale and how it's deployed. But then you have this 5 or 6 story single bay window, glass and steel, starting to announce that it's made with a different technology. So the idea of legibility is coming through, and the recognition that there's something about the power of the bay window in San Francisco which is intrinsic to its character. Another project by Applegarth. This time he partnered with McDonald Applegarth. This is the Heinemann building. Have you guys seen this? It's right across from Crown Zellerbach. You have the Shell Oil on the right. It's 20 feet wide. It's 10 stories tall. It's one of the skinniest buildings in San Francisco, right? And again, it's kind of recognized the power of the bay. Like there was no moves to make in 20 feet. And so it's just kind of understanding it's getting that free space is popping out. And it feels undeniably San Franciscan, even if it's distorted in its geometry a little bit. We all know this, right? The Palace of Fine Arts, Bernard Maybeck. This was for the Pan American Exhibition in 1915. This was meant to show the world that San Francisco had recovered from the fire. And you know, although it has many classical elements to it, you know, as design students, we can start to see patterns in it which become interesting. And I should kind of take a step out for a second and say, I am not an architectural historian, right? I'm a designer who loves history because history provides context and inspiration for how we build now. And so, you know, looking up at the bottom of the dome, the Palace of Fine Arts, this is an amazing pattern. And if any of you make anything like this, I would be extremely happy as your instructor, right? So you can find inspiration in lots of different places. 1917, right, we have the Halliday Building, the first glass curtain wall. And even though, you know, we look at its kind of adornment at the top of the cake as a little bit frilly, this is an innovation in building technology. And the whole thing is hanging off the front, completely glass, right? So the fact that we have the first example of a curtain wall building in San Francisco, this is something that we should all be seeing, right? It's not something that it should be new to you. Although this doesn't appear modern, this has some roots. So this is Julia Morgan's home. Now, I don't know if you know Julia Morgan. She recently won the AIA Gold Medal many years after her death. But she was a student of Bernard Maybeck and was sponsored by the Hearst family. And so she actually owned both houses. They had built in the 1860s, and then she renovated them in 1923 by eliminating the top floor on the house on the left so that she could get light and air, right? And the desire to clear out of Victorian to get light and air is an inherently modern impulse to change the interior structure of the house. So, you know, this is the context that you may have gone up and down. This is on Divisadero and, I don't know, Sacramento. You've probably gone by it a number of times and never looked at it. And then infrastructure. Infrastructure is inherently modern. This is the bridge between off of Miguel Street and over 280. And part of it is the original 1929 structure, and part of it is the subsequent seismic bracing underneath it that evokes some of the ideas of Robert Mayer or something like that, where you're saying, you know, how do you get a long span? How do you start to express that in different ways? 1932, this is the Dolger headquarters. Do you guys know who Henry Dolger is? Have you heard that name? So Henry Dolger was a developer who developed all of the Sunset District and most of Daly City. And although maybe you haven't heard his name, at one point he was developing 4,000 houses in the Sunset District, right? And so this was, you know, his attempt to find modernity in the modern, right? So this is at 9th and Judah. And you can look at the kind of civic scale of the entry, the streamlined front, the glass blocks. It was trying to present a new front for how people moving westward in San Francisco would be. And we don't even think about that. We think of the whole city. But up until the 30s, right, from Golden Gate Park west was a lot of sand dunes. There was not a lot there. And so the idea of how you would entice people to get out there was this hope of modern living. And then there's these examples of fantastic anonymous architecture. I don't know, it's a little hard to see this. This house is on Oak near the Panhandle, but you know, it has this steel sash window system, this defined entry in the middle, a bay on the right-hand side, but it's not a trapezoidal bay. It's kind of working with all the rhythms and patterns and the scale of the city in a very humble way. Timothy Pfluger, master of Art Deco. This is Roosevelt Middle School on Geary and Arguello. And you can start to look at the way that he's employing the architectonic expression of brick, right? That it has this kind of almost Dutch mastery of how brick is being used. But then the glass is infill between here. So the language, even though the material feels a little bit older, it's about frame and infill. And as I'm going through these, have you guys seen any of these buildings? Do they seem familiar? And when you were looking at them, did you think like, oh, this is good? Or you're just like, hey, there's something? A little both. the Schiff House, so 1937. So now we're getting into modernism proper, right? So 1937, the Schiffs, Richard Neutra. As you know, Richard Neutra was an Austrian emigre. He came to the United States to work for Frank Lloyd Wright, and he built a triplex in the marina, right? So there's actually 3 units here, and he ran the window system across the entry on the side. So every house in San Francisco has an entry on the side. You go up the stairs, you have some sort of bays, it steps back. It's just very clean, very unobtrusive, very modern. I had a chance to go in it with a second owner, and he told me he bought this for $250,000 under market value in 1989 because it was too modern for the marina, even though it was built before everything else. But simultaneously, if the Schiff House is looking at international modernism, the same year, Neutra is realizing that California is something different. California is something special, and it can have a different expression. And so he did the Darling House. The Darling House is right near UCSF. And it was the first time when he started to take this idea of the white material-lessness of it and put redwood siding, right? That it was really about fitting into the landscape, being appropriate to what the materials were here in California, softening this modernism to make it a warm modernism. 1938, we have a second Roos house. So you saw the one by Bernard Maybeck. This is John Dinwiddie. And this is for his son. And Dinwiddie had worked for Eliel Saarinen and was trying to bring this new kind of European modernism into the context. And at the same time, you have the beginnings of what's called the Second Bay tradition, where the architects are trying to figure out what it means to be in California. A lot of times that was cladding the building in clapboard siding, wood shingles, something to warm it up so that it didn't have this cool quality of international modernism. You can see it has a singular bay window, which is canted towards the view of the Bay Bridge, the Golden Gate Bridge. It's absolutely fantastic. 1939, you have the Kahn House by Neutra. In terms of sequence, this is a little funny because it's more traditional in its international quality, but it was probably being built all at the same time as the other houses. This is on Telegraph Hill, and it cantilevers out on top of the hill, 3 stories, continuous ribbon windows that run across the side. It's the epitome of what the international style of modernism is. But then there's still this struggle for, are we modern? Are we modern? What does San Francisco become? This is the towers for the, let's see, where are we here? The Aquatic Park Towers by William Moser Sr. and Jr., father and son. And so this was to referee swimming events, right? But you get this kind of very massive expression, but at the same time stripped down. It has this iconic silhouette to it. Lakeside Medical Building. So this is out on the west side of San Francisco and trying to deal with the modern and the Art Deco and make a sense of place. And another anonymous building, this is a beautiful apartment complex in Russian Hill. I don't know who the architect is. I've been trying to find out for years. But you look, it has this formality, this central access, these canted bay windows that is modestly scaled, but completely San Franciscan as you look at it. Similarly, these apartment buildings in the marina where the bay window doesn't have to be trapezoidal, right? That it's taking a plane, it's bending a plane to maximize the view, in this case, again, towards the Golden Gate Bridge. And then, what does it mean to have an apartment building? This is probably the least San Franciscan of the examples, but I think it's fantastically modern. This is by Irving Goldstein. This is 1949. This is in the Richmond district off of Geary Boulevard. And then you can see, glass floor to ceiling, ventilation panels. Everything is expressed, right? Nothing is hidden. It's completely transparent in how it's made. This is the V.C. Morris gift shop by Frank Lloyd Wright. It is the first time he built a spiral ramp, although he had been designing spiral ramps for years beforehand. And it's important to see this building both in the context of Union Square, but also that it's part of a triptych of buildings, right? So in 1949, you have V.C. Morris gift shop, 1959, you have the Guggenheim Museum. 1969, you have the Marin County Civic Center, all of which have these circular or ovoid atria and some sort of upward movement through them. And you can see that he's working with the same theme throughout all of these periods of time. And we have two of those, right, the bookends of those in Marin County and V.C. Morris here. And so we should really be visiting them, understanding them. And I'll say another aside, as students, it's like your responsibility to get into buildings even if it doesn't feel comfortable, right? Like just go and walk in and say, I'm an architecture student. I need to see this Frank Lloyd Wright building. And even if they're trying to say, you know, no, thank you, force your way in. Now's the time that you can do that. I mean, within the bounds of the law. Here we have a laundromat by Mario Chompy. This is in the Excelsior. I photographed this in black and white because it's painted colors that are way too garish to share with you. But again, you can see this idea of this rounded facade as it's dealing with intersecting geometries, ribbon window, elevated, you know, extremely modern expression hidden in a kind of plain sight in a modest neighborhood. This is in Forest Hills. Henry Hill and John Dinwiddie actually had a partnership for a period of time. But Henry Hill went to the GSD, Graduate School of Design at Harvard in 1938. He studied from Walter Gropius. So he's taking from the Bauhaus master, right, and he's bringing it back to San Francisco and saying, all right, now what is a Bauhaus bay window, right? It's not trapezoidal, so you get this semicircular bay window. You get these alternating panels of fixed glass and operable glass, and it's kind of nestled into the landscape. Also Henry Hill, this is a duplex by Buena Vista Park, and you can start to see some of the languages, or maybe you can't in this light, but again of operable panel and the expression of what that means, and then cladding the whole thing in redwood siding. Has anybody ever seen this peeking through the corner? So this is was Mount Zion, was Menomedes Hospital. This is Erich Mendelsohn. So Erich Mendelsohn, the famous German modern master, fled Europe after the war, and then he came to San Francisco and he did a couple of projects. He set up a partnership with Henry Hill and Dinwiddie for a while, but he did this hospital, which is now UC, and he also did this house. This is the Russell House, which is absolutely fantastic. If you look at it, it's got a 3/4 cylindrical bay window, and it's on a pipe column that's about 3 inches in diameter that goes up 5 stories. Now, I can't get a structural engineer to do anything that thin, but it's survived for, 70 years. It's doing okay. So, you need to really look around to find it. The trees have grown up much more, so it's a little harder to see, but it's worth exploring and seeing this masterpiece. This is a Corpus Christi Church by Mario Ciampi, and again, trying to think about how to change liturgical architecture. The cruciform mullions actually used to protrude and were a brise soleil. They've been replaced by terrible, cheap aluminum mullions, and so you have to use a little bit of your imagination, but again, thinking about how to get beautiful architecture that's just in the neighborhoods. This is a house in Diamond Heights by Worcester Bernard Emmons. And this is really kind of straddling between the second and third Bay traditions, but it's a shingled house. You can see it almost has some Japanese qualities with the extending rafter tails, but then they've positioned windows asymmetrically to maximize the view. This church, I don't show the interior, but I just show this. This is up at the top of where Tower Market is. And this was done by all people of John Portman. So if you know the Hyatt and Embarcadero, this is the same architect, but 20 years span between what he's starting to do. The Golden Gate Flower Pavilion, this is 1959, and that is Appleton and Wolfred. Right, so this is by the Arboretum. And I'm presuming you guys all know this. I'm sure in 110 and 150 everybody sent you out to see this, right? But the Crown Zellerbach, the masterpiece of office structure, by SOM, a pavilion with the folded roof plate and everything being lifted off the ground, the detached core, and the curtain wall. So all of these things are kind of acting together and then dealing with a triangular site. So how it's positioned on the site, how the pavilion works and the building work are all set free. Forest Hills Christian Church by Norman Gaddis. And what you don't necessarily see from this photo is that the roof is a ruled surface, so that everything is a straight beam, and as it's going from the front, it's at a high peak, and as it goes to the back, it shifts to a low peak. You know, you guys are doing these drawings in studio, you're thinking these are new things, right? People have been doing this, you know, before there was complicated ways to computer model things. They were just drawing it and measuring with a slide rule. Joe Eschrich, this is the Larson House. This is 1962, right? Now, if I put this in Dwell, it would be on the cover right now. And so to really start to understand what proportion, what geometry, how the bay pulls forward, how it's engaging with its. This is a weird one. This is an accessory structure to the Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church by Reed, Rockwell, Banwell, and Terex. Don't make me say that twice. But it's this beautiful folded roof with glue lambs, right? It's simple. It's something that we would design now, right? And here it is, you know, again, more than 50 years later, we can start to look at this thing and see how it's surviving and what its strengths are. Favorite office building in San Francisco. Does anybody seen this one? Right? Right? It's this little glass structure by A.E. Wagerman off of St. Mary's Square. It's 3 stories. It's got this split level stair at the front, so everything is transparent. It's just a jewel. Sure. Diamond Heights, right? Have you guys been to Diamond Heights? Have you been up to Diamond Heights? Diamond Heights was an entire experiment in modernism in San Francisco. It had been covered with green and goats, right? It was this kind of random place. And Joe Eichler, who is a developer, started to approach the hill and started to think how to reshape it. And there was a lot of alternate views of what might have happened here, but these were what were built. So these were apartment buildings by Cohen and Leverson. And you can see that although they don't have the bay proper, they have the balconies that protrude out into that space and start to get the bay effect. So again, Joe Eichler, who did a lot of developments in the peninsula and in the North Bay, had an ill-fated attempt at making a tower. He made a beautiful tower, right? This is 999 Greene Street with Claude Oakland and Nell Greene. This almost destroyed his company. His son almost left and kind of took that apart, and Joe Eichler kept the top 2 units for himself. But it is spectacular. It is muscular. It's very evocative in its forms and geometries, and it's, you know, coming out of this post-war housing boom. What Eichler made for the rest of people are something like this, right? So this is also in Diamond Heights. It has almost a Schindler-esque vibe with the carport and balcony beneath it. And here you can start to see variations of the model by Claude Oakland with vertical windows, with CMU walls, with shading trellises. In 1967, SOM does the Alcoa building out by the Embarcadero. I know you guys have all seen this one. You know, its significance is that this is one of the first times where the structure is pulled to the outside of the building. So rather than being inboard of the curtain wall, it's outside of it, and it's expressing all the dynamic qualities of the seismic landscape in which we're living. And modernism can also straddle this line between architecture and art. This is the Safety Wall by Stephen Novak, 1968. So this is above Diamond Heights where Clipper comes into Market Street. And this was to keep cars from careening off the edge into the back of all those beautiful Eichlers I showed you earlier, right? So rather than putting a building there, this piece of modern sculpture was installed. This is a kind of ubiquitous building that may not get your attention, but this is the UA Cinema, or the Cinema Twin at Stonestown, 1970. It has this beautiful colonnade where there's a kind of a very subtle groin vault that feels almost like an Edward Durrell Stone building. And as I was recently told by someone from DoCoMo, it's now 50, right? Which means that this qualifies for historic preservation. And so as we're starting to look at these things, we can start to see, you know, how we value different buildings in our community and if they have some integrity that we want to keep going forward. French Hospital. This is Pafford Keating Clay. Pafford Keating Clay is an amazing architect. He apprenticed for Frank Lloyd Wright at Taliesin. He worked for Le Corbusier. He married Siegfried Gideon's daughter. He was good friends with Mies van der Rohe. He's like at the nexus of all things modern. And this is now the Kaiser on Geary and 6th. But it's this mix of a concrete Le Corbusier structure with this idea of Mies van der Rohe kind of expressing the columns. It's since been altered in some ways. They've infilled the bottom so it doesn't feel like it's lifted up as much, but it's important to know the context in which it was made. And then Pafford Keating Clay's masterpiece is the San Francisco Art Institute, right? So it's an addition to the Bakewell and Brown original structure on the backhand side. Bakewell and Brown are the architects that did City Hall, right? They did most of Stanford's campus. They have this idea of making this California kind of mission-style, modern something or other. And Keating Clay put this Le Corbusier-esque addition to the back, and I even question saying esque because he basically stole all the details from Le Corbusier's atelier and put them in here. So the original handrails, the light scoops, this amazing ramp that cuts through the middle and goes 2 stories through the building. The brise soleil on the outside is absolutely fantastic. St. Mary's Cathedral, Pierluigi Nervi and Pietro Belluschi, right? Again, looking at ruled surfaces. Here, everything done with straight lines. They made this grand cathedral, and if you look at the interior, it comes down to these 4, what I call kind of elephant foot columns. Everything is held apart. You can see that there's this cruciform of glass between each of these shells. It's absolutely spectacular. Villecourt Fountain, some people hate this. I happen to love it, but again, context is everything. You have to remember that when this was there was 12 lanes of elevated freeway between the city and the Embarcadero. And so what Justin Herman and Lawrence Halprin and Mario Chompy were trying to do was create an outdoor public space that had some sort of white noise element that could diffuse the sound of all of those cars and that could have a formal presence that could stand up against the background of 12 lanes of traffic. You guys all know this, right? The Transamerica Pyramid by Pereira. But I don't know if you've seen, not only is the building itself beautiful, but there's an amazing redwood garden right next to it. Have you guys gone and seen this? Right, so they planted 80 fully mature redwoods next to it, and they're dwarfed by the tower. Right, so at the time the Transamerican Pyramid was made, I think it was the 4th tallest building in America. And to have this contrast of the absolute height of nature versus the absolute height of man is really interesting. Sutro Tower, you know, after the Golden Gate Bridge, maybe the most iconic element in San Francisco. We don't think of San Francisco of not having it, right? But 1973, it was built at the top of Twin Peaks. It was by Furman, Anderson Jr., and Simpson, Gumpert, and Hager. And it's an amazing piece of infrastructure. It defines San Francisco, you know. And so thinking about whether we're looking at buildings or other technologies, what is it that makes this place feel as it does, right? And how can we draw inspiration from that? The Origami Fountain by Aruthurazawa in Japantown. Aruthurazawa is now finally getting some due as an artist, but for a long time she was kind of not exactly wallowing in obscurity, but not getting the recognition that she deserved. 1970, so Aruthurazawa was Japanese-American. She was interned during World War II, went on to Black Mountain College and studied with Buckminster Fuller and Joseph Albers. And in 1972, she applied for a Guggenheim Fellowship. Buckminster Fuller wrote a recommendation and said that she was the most creative person he had ever met in his entire life. Now, if you know the history of Buckminster Fuller, that's amazing. What's also amazing is she didn't get the scholarship because she had 3 kids and she was teaching at a public school, and the Guggenheim didn't think that she was a serious artist. And so they gave out 22 scholarships that year, only 1 to a woman, and Ruth Ozawa was not it. So I give you that context to realize how amazing and how special these pieces are. We might walk by them all the time and not know that they're there, right? But if, again, you're looking at thin-shelled geometries, you're looking at stiffening practices, like it's all there in this piece. It's easy to go see and explore and understand. The Grand Hyatt by John Portman. Again, this was built when there was 12 lanes of freeway there, and so it steps back to go back and high above the freeway. It has one of the most amazing atriums that you'll ever see in a building. A lot of people will call it brutalist. It is. It's also spectacular. And so I think it's worth kind of going and understanding that. And then kind of the last of the modernist elements that I kind of end in 1975 is the San Francisco State Student Union building by Pafford Keating Clay. This was one of the last projects he executed before he fled the country for tax evasion. But it's absolutely amazing. It's got these 2 truncated pyramids that kind of shoot up at different angles. One was kind of a cone of silence. One was about performance. And you get these geometries, these scuppers, these wall planes, which would be completely contemporary now. You know, post-1975 in San Francisco, everything went to hell in a handbasket, as it did lots of different places. People were fighting for modernism for a long time. Even as early as the early 2000s, when I came back to San Francisco after college and I started practicing, I would tell people I was a modern architect, and they'd like, modernism? Like, San Francisco is not about modernism? And I say, like, yes, it is. And so, you know, the intent of showing these things to you is to show you what the richness of things are in San Francisco, where you can draw inspiration and how it's connected to all different architects from all over the country, right? As you take Braden's class and you start talking about modernism, it's not something that happens someplace else. But secondarily, you should start to see how it influences the future of San Francisco architecture. And so here are a few examples of projects by Anne Fougeron, Stanley Sadowitz, Edmonds and Lee, Owen Kennerly, Iwamoto Scott, Adlin Darling, where they are making new interpretations of San Francisco projects, right? All of them are invariably San Franciscan. All of them are working in some way to find a way to push against, but to work with the context of scale, proportion, and space. And this is what I kind of hope to offer you guys, that our city is a place of endless inspiration, that you should be able to look at it in lots of different ways, not only look at the past, but also to have ideas for how your work can fit in it into the future. Thank you. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Ethan. That was excellent. You mentioned a few times that there's 2 or 3 different generations of modern architects in the Bay Area. I wonder if you could tell all of our students so that they have some help, maybe when they're wandering around the city, they identify a piece that looks like modern architecture. What sort of values or characteristics would they look for that would tell them it's second generation or first or third?
That's a great question. So how do you know what's modern? How do you know what generation it is? So I think the easiest is arts and crafts. You can start to look for Bernard Maybeck and see some beautiful wood curly cues and shingle siding, and you're good. From there, you have a generation that's pre-World War II. Then after World War II, a lot of the architects had been in the Navy. They came back to San Francisco or the Bay Area and started to work, and they were trying to find this balance. And so they would kind of, the second generation of the Bay tradition is often shingled. It will have extending eaves to it. And then the third, that wood quality, but oftentimes it's with horizontal clapboard siding.
Sure.
Thanks, Ethan. It was awesome. Do you have? Could you provide your list somewhere on the? It would be awesome to just have access to the list. I think it also would be great for the students, because if they really want to go out and want to do a tour out there, they kind of, and maybe there would be even a little project together with the students to create a map of some kind of these projects. I think that would be great.
So the short answer is, I mean, that's what social media is for. Like, my entire Instagram platform is not pictures of my kid and my dog, although they occasionally show up. It's all buildings and art. And so if you want to see that, go find those. As far as a map or a list, I haven't put that together. That's in the works in some form. But if you guys have specific buildings you want to see, let me know. But really, you should just go out and look. You should hoof it, right? It's 7 miles by 7 miles. It's not that hard to find buildings and to find things that are interesting. You just have to go out and not Uber for a minute and walk around and look.
Thank you, Ethan. I love the walking tour. You mentioned that essay. So in Doron's review last week, we mentioned critical of the literal and phenomenal transparency, and then you also brought up a critical regionalism by Kenneth Frampton, and we had actually traded notes that that's another important essay. So what aspects would you say, what aspects in that essay would you say is the critical regionalism characteristic of what you just shared with us? And I know it's a very broad question.
Yeah, it'll be, it'd be hard for me to point to a specific part in the essay without kind of looking at it to refamiliarize myself, but I think you can start to look for underlying patterns, repetition of not necessarily native, but vernacular architecture. So for residential, right, and for most of San Francisco for many years, it was all residential, or a majority of it was, is, that we have the 25-foot wide lot, you have a biased entry, you have a bay window, which is protruding out to get extra square footage, you have a proportional height that's a vertical rectangle to maximize the 40-foot height limit. Oftentimes it's under that. And then you'll have kind of barbell plans where you have light wells to let light into the narrow, long floor plates.
I just want to encourage you to share your Instagram label. There you go. Just one more time. And also, DoCoMo does actually have maps, I believe, on their website, if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So do you guys know about DoCoMo? So DoCoMo is an organization that's dedicated to documenting and preserving modern architecture throughout the United States. We have a chapter here, DoCoMo NorCal. And they have fantastic maps of, 50 or 60 buildings in the city. The AIA SF also has a list of 25 of its favorite buildings, a lot of which overlap, although some will be a little bit more contemporary. And there's also guidebooks. There's all of these architects in the architectural world are significant and famous. You can find books on them. Like, there's no shortage of books on William Worcester, right? There's no shortage of books on Frank Lloyd Wright. You can find these things. So, okay. Thanks, guys.